Thank you. It's really good to be here. And of course, I know some of you, there's some new faces there. Obviously, you know, ANU and our doors are always open to different kinds of contact and questions and connection with our work. And there's very strong ties between ANU and UQ in all sorts of different ways. So just checking, I've got about 30 minutes. Is that right? So Christine is probably the person who can tell me that. Was that the plan?
Yeah, so you've got a little bit
questions.
Yeah, you've got a little bit more if you need it, but I think go for that. Yeah.
Okay, so it's very good to be here. I mean, it's a great opportunity for me to update some of you with what's been happening with a program of work we've been running in education, drawing heavily, of course, on social identity and self-categorization theory ideas. This is a project that has gone on for about 10 years. So as you can see, there's a whole range of people who have collaborated and been part of this program of work over this time. So I wanted to just take you through the sort of abstract, because I took this to be an invitation to have, you know, to obviously outline the work, but also to have a bit more of a conversation about this trajectory of research and to see some of the things that we might have learnt through this program of work that could be relevant to you, as we all, of course, look to ensuring that the work that we're doing connects with real world issues and problems, has impact, and sort of builds capacity, I guess, to make sure that our ideas are having the best outreach that they can. So this was the abstract. It was a little bit rough, but I did want to spend some time talking to you about this program of work over the last 10 years. It's focused on school outcomes for students, such as academic achievement, NAPLAN. Some of you might know that that's the national assessment of students' kind of learning. It's very much focused on well-being, so I think it connects with some of the work that's been done around social cure and the interest, of course, that UQ has in that. And also, it looks at a school outcome around bullying and aggression. It's not, some of you might have heard me present about the student work before. I have been talking about it at various conferences and forums, including in Queensland, SASP and the Social Identity Health Forum. But we've also been measuring staff surveys, and that becomes more like an organisational, behavioural, culture type measurement. And we've used the ILI to assess staff's perceptions of leadership in their school and the way that might be related to a range of outcomes for staff: commitment, morale, performance. There's other DVs in there, their own sort of well-being, burnout and stress. So I wanted to update you on that. But I thought that some of you might be interested in this, in sort of towards the end, just, well, what have we learnt about trying to work with the one party, the one end user in a way, in partnership? That's the ACT Education Directorate. You know, how has it been, I guess, managing that relationship, establishing it, and ensuring that we can renew it in ways that that make sure that we are pushing our own academic interest as well as their policy type interests. So there's a bit to cover, so we'll see how we go. So this is the sort of overview of where we began and where we are now. And of course, these are some of the postdocs that have worked on the project: Imran Lee, Deanna Cardenas, who's a current postdoc on the project, and Katie Click. But these people here are people in the Education Directorate. And in fact, in thinking about a trajectory of research that's gone over 10 years or so, these people have been absolutely invaluable. Robert Gotts, Kath and Alex have had some contact with him, is currently sort of have oversight of the project. But all of these people, I've got very fond memories of connecting with all of them. Some of they've come and gone, right? So in a sense, there's no one in the department currently that was there when we began. So there is something there about also managing these relationships as you change responsibility. But all these people have played quite a critical role. So what's interesting about this project is it started with some seed money, it moved into an ARC linkage grant, and then after the ARC linkage grant, the department decided it would fund the contribution that the ARC had made itself, and it would continue to fund the program of work that we've done. And it's sort of changed in emphasis a little bit as we've gone through different agreements with the ACT Education Directorate. So up until, so 2014, so what's that? So that's quite a few years, 7 years into the relationship, all ACT schools, public schools, grades 5 to 12, it's now gone down to grade 4, complete a survey that we developed, both staff, students, and parents and carers. So what the department was doing in terms of assessing things to do with school satisfaction have effectively become the product of this project itself, and that is ongoing. One of the things that we did that has set this program of work up in a very strong way is we ensured we could track the responses across time. So that's meant that the work that's been done since, well, throughout the program, but in particular, all students, all staff, all parents and carers are now part of a longitudinal research project effectively. So that just keeps growing in value. So some of the characteristics of this work is it's aligned with basic research questions and it's of policy interest to them, and they are absolutely aligned goals. So there's some things we have to do that present the work in a particular way, but what we're interested in is really what they're interested in. We've been able to develop a new integrative theoretical analysis that builds on lots of work in education through bringing the social identity self-categorization theory ideas to it. It's got innovative elements in its design. There's limited restrictions on our academic activity, which of course is a real strength with these kind of relationships. And there's a lot of people who can be interested in the work that we're doing because it's crossing social, health, clinical, and education psychology domains. So, I mean, I guess that gives you a bit of context for the work and what I'm going to talk about next. I am having a few challenges with, oh yes. So I guess that this is where the project kind of sits now. I mean, because we're measuring in particular all students between grades 4 and 12 in the ACT, it's a very rich sample to investigate some of these questions and challenges around young people today. There's an argument that young people are facing significant change and that they're not transitioning very well to adulthood, that there are all sorts of indicators that tell us that there are real challenges for young people. So this is one of the emphasis that we have in terms of making a case for the work and also demonstrating the impact of the work. So of course, one of those challenges is to do with technology. You might have seen this kind of graph, which this is loneliness. I felt lonely. I often feel lonely, and a lot of times I feel lonely, and we can see that loneliness has increased. And some people are arguing that that is connected to a social media type activity. And so we know that young people are facing these challenges. And we also know that there's a body of work in relation to well-being that tells us that the school is a really important context for building positive futures for young people. So this work by Resnick and colleagues, very large sample of US adolescents, looked at range of risk factors for young people and demonstrated that students' responses to these five questions was significantly seen to be a protective factor against a whole range of health risks for young people, except early pregnancy. And you can see that when you look at those 5 items, a direct kind of relationship to the ways in which we would capture social identification and perhaps school identification in the theoretical work that we're doing. So really what we wanted to do in this project is to try and build a bridge between some of the concepts that sit within education in particular about young people's well-being and outcomes, and see if it was possible to conceptually add conceptual clarity and integrative potential and have a psychological process account through integration with social identity ideas and perspectives. And if we look at some of the definitions in, obviously in psychology, but sort of taken into the educational space, we see this concept of school climate, which is about the patterns of people's experiences in schools, reflects norms, goals, values, relationships, and structures. So we could think about school climate as really capturing some of the characteristics of a group. Connectedness is really about the degree to which people feel they're cared about in their learning as individuals within the school system. And relatedness is really about the bonds that people are forming and whether they think those relationships are secure and connected or not. So in this project, we've tried to bring those ideas together and integrate them with obviously core concepts within the social identity perspective. I'm not going to introduce this to you other than to say that we've been able to make a case that you can think of a school as an intergroup system, as a group. You can think of it as a superordinate group. You can think about it as a school is made up of different subgroups. You can think about all of the ideas that relate to our understandings of groups in general applying to a school, and that our work has been trying to bring this kind of thinking to the educational literature and to the ways in which schools think about their practice with respect to school outcomes. The basic model has been this, where we've assessed school climate effectively being the characteristics that might define the group. And there's a body of work in education, a very strong body of work that's clearly shown a relationship between positive school climate and a whole range of school outcomes. The argument that we've been making is that in order to explain that relationship, it's necessary to better understand the degree to which the school becomes a self-relevant and meaningful group for students. And of course, we've also looked at staff as well. So we've been measuring school climate and improving the measurement of school climate in the work that we've been doing. We've obviously introduced identification as a psychological mechanism that might help us better understand school outcomes. So the argument is that you would need to have a positive group, a positive school climate, and you would need to feel that that group was psychologically significant. There was a sense of connection and belonging for school climate to come to have an impact on school outcomes. So a model, I'm sure that's very familiar to many of you. The projects had sort of 2 main aims: to assess those relationships. Can we show that that relationship holds in schools? Does it help integrate bodies of work in the education literature? And can we show it across a range of different outcomes, including behavioural outcomes such as achievement? We've also been working with schools to try and better understand how they might build a positive school climate and build school identification and track the outcomes. So can we show that these interventions are having a positive impact on the outcomes of interest? So we think that this work also, of course, investigates social identity predictions in a new context and expands the scope of that work. We've been able to integrate and extend existing theory and research. This is something perhaps we can talk about a little bit later. You know, I think for a period of time, my thinking was that the comparative advantage of a place like ANU and the theoretical work that we were doing, the laboratory-based work that we were doing, better understanding the theory and testing it in particular ways, that once we've kind of published the work, that it was there for other people to pick up and use and to try and translate. And that really wasn't our comparative advantage. And the best job that we could do was to continue to develop in very sort of controlled environments and push some of the evidence around sort of the theoretical ideas. But I think what's happened in this program of work is that actually that is a really hard thing to do. We found it very challenging to think, well, how do you take these ideas and explain to a school what they might do to build a positive school climate and school identification? And in fact, the best people to help do this translation and application of theory are really the people who know those ideas most deeply. And so I guess there's been a bit of sort of eating humble pie there, where actually it is perhaps the responsibility of people like me and obviously the people that work with me on this project to actually have a stake in trying to see whether it can translate and be applicable to very complex naturalistic settings. And of course, we also seek to strengthen the interface between social psychology and public policy. So this is the student and staff kind of surveys to give you a bit of an overview of sort of, I guess, our IVs, mediators, and our DVs. So we have developed the measure of school climate, and I can show you a little bit about that. So we now have a reliable and valid new measure of school climate and school identification that is the other research groups are using around the world, because there'd been lots of good work, but there hadn't been very tight work around the sub-factors of school climate. And there hadn't been any measure that kind of integrated all the work in the education literature on belonging and connectedness in schools really to the school climate work. So we now see these as interrelated aspects of school life that can be measured and assessed. And on the outcome side, we've obviously done some work on NAPLAN, student wellbeing, bullying and victimisation, student engagement, which of course should connect with achievement outcomes. We've looked at staff wellbeing, staff job involvement, staff performance, and we have sort of measures of morale, commitment that are also of interest, obviously, to organisations such as the Education Directorate. So I want to take you through some of the results, but I guess it's just, you know, timely to see if anyone's got anything they'd like clarified there, or they've got any specific questions about anything I've said so far.
Kate, just a question about the school climate indicators, right? So I wondered to what extent they're conceptually distinct, or there's quite a bit of overlap, really. It's all about, yeah, I like my school, I love everyone there, and so it's positivity about school versus negativity. Like, if you do you see that they are, you know, there is high correlation between them anyway, right? Or how does that work?
Yeah, there is high correlation between them. I mean, we've argued that, so this is sort of one of the papers that validates the measure. You can see the correlation there, right? You know, so between school climate and school identification, we've argued that they remain distinct but related constructs. And I guess the real strength of this work that we did on measurement was really for the first time we were able to show that these sub-factors are actually can be demonstrated to be distinct and contributing to this concept of school climate. So yeah, we've argued related but distinct.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, ongoing then. So, you know, we've been just testing this model basically with with less and more sophistication because we've got better data as it's become more longitudinal. So we've been interested in a school climate factor, the relationship between school climate and an outcome of interest, and then of course whether we can see evidence of a significant full or partial mediation through school identification, and controlling for as many things as we can think are relevant as we go through to develop this work. So most of this work here is cross-sectional, and we've been able to show that there are benefits from looking at both school climate and school identification in terms of trying to understand school outcomes. And of course, the more evidence that you show that those relationships are important, in particular for areas that something like an education directorate is really focused on. So, you know, they're of course very focused on academic achievement. They're very challenged by bullying and victimization in schools. And they do increasingly see their responsibility as being not only about the achievement of young people in their schools, but also the well-being. And so I guess across the time, you know, the value of this kind of work has increased to the department itself. And, you know, they want to keep sort of trying to better quantify these things, like how much of a contribution does school climate or school identification make to an increased, I don't know, increased score on NAPLAN, so more and more sophisticated models. But certainly it starts to say to schools that there are things that they can do day to day that are going to have an impact on the outcomes that are of interest. And I think in most cases that's empowering for staff and teachers within the school, and has led them to think, I think, a bit more seriously about their organisation and the impact it might have on outcomes. You've seen this already because of Yolanda's question, but this is for students, and we're currently validating this. Seeing if we can validate the measurement tool that we have for staff and for parents and carers. So that's happening this year. We have looked at some of the longitudinal models. Some of that work's published, some of it is in being progressed, hopefully, to publication. But we've run, for example, these kind of latent growth curve models to demonstrate that change in school identification across time is related to change in bullying across time. So, so that we can demonstrate that, in fact, if a school controlling for lots of things and having longitudinal data of the same student across time, that if students come to increase their identification with the school, then we can also see that that same student is less likely to engage in bullying activity. And we now have models like this for all of the outcomes that that we're focused on. So some of you would have heard that sort of work before, and I did want to just update you a little bit of where we're sort of heading. So obviously, as time's gone on, we've got better and better data sets where we now can look at both staff and students' outcomes in longitudinal 3-year models. We have run up to 5-year models, and we've been doing some work there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Nick and others will be happy to hear that we've been looking at ILI and a range of staff outcomes and running longitudinal models to ask the question whether leadership as assessed by ILI at time 1 is related to a more positive school climate at time 2, which is related to better staff outcomes at time 3. So that says to the Education Directorate, and Alex has shared some of his work here as well, that if they invested in building identity leadership skills of their leadership teams in schools, then they could anticipate improved outcomes on dimensions that they really care about for their staff. We've been part of a national program of work, so we've run a project effectively for COAG, where based on the work here in the ACT, all jurisdictions, Queensland included, have wanted information about how are all the jurisdictions currently measuring wellbeing, what are high quality measures of wellbeing, and how might they move to improve the way in which they do that across the jurisdictions in Australia. And in terms of this idea of do interventions matter, we've been looking at a very extensive intervention. It comes out of the US. It's been implemented in certain states in Australia. It's school-wide positive behavioural support is the program. And we've been looking at whether that intervention effectively has an impact on outcomes of interest in schools. So can we develop evidence that actually what all these jurisdictions has invested in is actually improving the outcomes for students? And can we compare schools that have done that intervention with schools that haven't, and do that across time to help give information about whether that's a program that you would adapt, change, stop running, or run in different ways. So let me just quickly, I mean, I think you've got the story, you're familiar with the arguments. I just wanted to quickly take you through some of the places where obviously the model has been confirmed, but also some areas where we haven't been able to see the model that I outlined in this longitudinal data. And I think that, you know, that raises some interesting questions. But in the main, most things that we're measuring, we are seeing longitudinal support for the model that I've outlined. So this is work, exactly the same kind of work I've sort of described before, but we're interested in whether we can measure school climate at time 1, school identification at time 2, and the outcome variables of interest for students and staff at time 3. And really for the first time with good N, see whether we can find support in a very conservative model really for the role of these independent variables on the outcomes of interest. So these are the things that we've looked at. We've got you know, probably 6,500 students who've been able to put into this model, and about 3,500 staff that we've been able to put into the model to explore it. And when we look at student outcomes, we find support for these longitudinal models on the outcomes of interest. Here I've just put wellbeing in particular because I thought this group might be interested in that. But classroom disruption, aggression, we can see evidence that there is significant mediation through school identification to the outcome of interest. So this is all staff, this is all student data. With staff data, with staff data, we find the same kind of patterns and have looked at the same kind of models effectively. We've obviously also looked at ILI. Again, ILI at time 1, that's year 1, say. Does ILI produce or lead to a more positive school climate at time 2, year 2? And is that related to outcomes for staff? So we have looked at a whole range of outcome variables, but we're not finding significant mediation for stress although we are finding it for different types of burnout, and we're not finding it in the context of professional development. So here are some of the relationships that we are finding. So we're seeing that leadership through school climate is not having an effect on stress. We're seeing that that's the same model. Sorry, I think that should have been a different. But here, for example, we're seeing an effect for organisational commitment, and here we're seeing an effect for self-esteem. So if we go back and look at all of the different things that we're measuring, it's stress and professional development where we're finding more complicated relationships. And we've also looked at this PBL program and been able to divide schools up who had the PBL program and those that didn't. There are a whole range of outcome variables that the department is interested in. But for us, I guess we're interested in whether did the program do anything to impact on school identification. And we can see that PBL is leading to increased identification across time compared to the control groups. And when a school implements the PBL program with fidelity, does it the right way, does it the way that they're meant to do it, does it in the way the manual sort of outlines it, we can see that schools with higher fidelity, it is leading to greater school identification. And we're doing sort of more work now on some of these PBL areas. So some conclusions, our view is the social identity perspective is adding value to explain a whole range of school outcomes. There's evidence that if you change school climate and change school identification, you can see a related change in the school outcomes across time. And that this is leading to policy and practice impact, at least here in the ACT, but we hope through some of the more recent work we've done also nationally, where there is renewed effort to look into ways to create a positive school climate and strengthen school identification. And there is sort of much more to do on that front. Some of you might be familiar with George Akeloff, and he's done obviously the book on identity economics, but he also has really clearly articulated that school identity is really what the focus of schools should be. And that schools should really be trying to inspire their students to identify with their school rather than teaching students to take standardized tests. And I guess on the basis of some of the evidence presented here, of course, it supports these kinds of statements. So I was going to go on just to talk a little bit about, well, what have we learned for this, with this kind of partnership and this kind of work, but I might just see if there's any questions first, and then I can just briefly highlight some of these that might be of interest.